This episode is brought to you by Curiosity Stream, a subscription streaming service that offers thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles. Right now, you guys can get 25% off the cost of a subscription. More on them in just a bit. On a southeast peninsula in Tasmania lies one of Australia's most chilling sights. Built in the 19th century, Port Arthur was the penal colony to end all penal colonies, an outpost of British justice located over 17,000 kilometres from the heart of the empire. Here, on this remote, windswept outcrop, convicts were funneled in by their thousands. Working class men, poor women from rural areas, children who'd committed some minor infraction, sent south over wild seas, they arrived to face a prison almost legendary for its hardships. It was here that convicts were put to work, building great ships that sailed the world. Here that utopian ideas of criminal justice reform created a separate prison infamous for its psychological cruelty. Yet there's more to Port Arthur than just a history of transport and torture. A key arrival point for many who came to Tasmania, Port Arthur was one of the seeds from which modern Australian society grew, a place that prepared some for a life of new riches on a new continent, even as it trapped others in a cycle of poverty and despair. Brutal, beautiful, iconic, haunted. This is the story of Australia's infamous penal colony. "51 kilometres southeast of the Tasmanian capital, Hobart, lies a collection of striking ruins. Seen today, Port Arthur Historic Site is starkly beautiful, a series of crumbling old buildings from the dawn of the colonial era. Yet behind that beauty lies a complex, tortured history, one that involved transportation, exploitation and violence, even as it laid the groundwork for modern Tasmania. Yet the story technically begins back in 1827, when the Lieutenant Governor of Demon's Land, as Tasmania was then known, looked at the peninsula and thought, "Lord Struth, this would make a bloody good place for a penal colony, wouldn't it?" But really, the story starts a few decades earlier in the 1780s, and it begins not with the founding of Port Arthur, but with a decision taken at the highest levels of British government. The decision to start transporting convicts to Australia. At the time, the British had just recently lost the American Revolutionary War, losing a potential place to send their unwanted criminals. With a lack of space to keep them at home, London's political elites had a brainwave. Why not combine punishment with some good old-fashioned colonial expansionism? Back in 1770, James Cook had charted Eastern Australia, claiming it for king and country. But keeping that claim would be a lot easier if there were some actual British people there to enforce it. People like Arthur Phillip. An experienced sailor and administrator, Phillip was told in 1786 to take hundreds of prisoners down under and establish a new penal colony. They landed in New South Wales in 1788, and while everyone came damn close to starvation, eventually they created a functioning society. They also succeeded in convincing London that this model was worth expanding. Because for all of its faults, it really did work. The stroke of genius was its non-permanent nature. Those who arrived in the colonies were prisoners, certainly, but they could see a future ahead of them, a future in which they would become free and be entitled to land grants. In other words, keep your head down, do your time, and in a few years, ka-ching. And so, the great era of convict transportation to Australia began, one which today informs the family background of some 20% of the population. But it wasn't just mainland Australia that saw these colonies spring up. By the early 19th century, the first transports had arrived in what we today call Tasmania, but what the British called Van Diemen's Land. Sadly for the island's indigenous population, the arrival of the British was less the dawn of a new era and more the extinction of everything that they had ever known. By the late 1820s and early 1830s, so many Tasmanian Aboriginals had been murdered that scholars today refer to it not as colonization, but as genocide. It was only toward the end of this era of bloodshed that the local Lieutenant Governor, George Arthur, was able to observe the wild Tasman Peninsula and declare a penal colony should be built there. By this point, convict transports were arriving regularly in modern-day Hobart and Launceston, a number that was only increasing now that Britain had severely reduced use of the death penalty in favour of sending people to the land of drop bears. But George Arthur had more in mind than simply giving London another place to send its criminals. The area he had selected was surrounded by vast forests and perched right on Carnarvon Bay, meaning ships could sail in to load up whatever the area produced. Rather than a simple colony, Arthur envisions an industrial harbour place that would fell trees, export lumber, and even get into the shipbuilding game. And convict transports would supply him with the forced labour needed to make that dream a reality. At the moment of its birth in 1830, Port Arthur was nothing like the UNESCO-listed site that we see today. On the contrary, it was merely a small timber station, an outpost of industry on a peninsula wild with woodland. Yet it wouldn't take long before this tiny outpost began to shape the landscape around it, to grow and expand like a living creature spreading across the bay. The key to this transformation? The convicts themselves. Those sent to Van Diemen's Land were usually young and usually poor, originally from either remote rural areas or the slums surrounding England's dark satanic mills. They were also usually male, with women making up only 20% of the convict arrivals. Nearly all of them had been sentenced for non-violent crimes, but where life at Port Arthur was different is that few were first-time offenders. Unlike most of the island's other penal colonies, Port Arthur was designed for repeat offenders, or those who'd arrived only to commit more crimes. And the colony's commandant, Charles O'Hara Booth, was determined to make them pay their social debt through back-breaking work. Beginning in 1833, the great task of creating Port Arthur was shouldered by its new inmates. That meant hacking away at the landscape, helping fell trees and construct buildings that would turn it into a viable settlement, starting with Charles Booth's grand house. Yet the point was not to cause suffering. Port Arthur may have been a hard place in a hard time, especially by modern standards, but it was at least supposed to be also something else, a way to give Britain's criminals a future. One thing to remember throughout this entire video is that it's taking place against a backdrop of endlessly evolving thought on the nature of justice. So the idea of being shipped to Australia and made to work felling timber might sound appalling to us, but at the time it was considered a massive step up from just chucking people into overcrowded dungeons. The convicts of Port Arthur would be worked to the bone, certainly, but they would also learn new skills, trades they could ply for profit once they'd served their time. The toughest of these trades was timber work. From its earliest days, Port Arthur was a leading source of lumber, with great convict gangs chopping down trees and sawing them into transportable chunks. It was nasty, dirty work, with the trees so massive saw pits had to be dug underneath them where they fell, with two convicts then slicing them up with a pit saw. This meant he then spent the day getting sawdust sprayed all over him, yet this discomfort was only the beginning. The log sliced had then had to be carried to the waterfront where the real sawing, sanding and refining was done. 50-odd men would hoist the damn thing onto their shoulders, slow walking it across the colony. From afar, people said that they kind of looked like a centipede. And woe betide anyone who tried to avoid the work. Charles Booth was of the "if it hurts, it works" school of encouragement. During his reign, slackers were beaten with a cat o' nine tails, or else hurled into a dark chamber for some enforced sensory deprivation. From a purely business point of view, though, his methods were a success. Right up to 1846, when it was surpassed by another penal colony, Port Arthur was the region's main timber producer. Yet felling trees was just a sideshow to the colony's real specialty, the thing that would make its name and supply its convicts with a real serious skill that they could use. We're talking about one of the 19th century's greatest trades of all, shipbuilding. Alright, we'll get back to today's video in just a moment, but first, here's a word from today's sponsor, CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a subscription streaming service that offers thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles from some of the world's best filmmakers, including exclusive originals. Think of it as the Netflix for nerds, the Hulu for history buffs. CuriosityStream is available on many platforms and web apps, including Roku, Android, Xbox One, Smart TVs, iOS, Chromecast, Amazon Fire, Amazon Kindle, and Apple TV. It's also offered worldwide, and with its constantly updated content, you'll always have something to watch. For example, this spring they added an 8-part series called The Bone Detectives. It's great stuff. Now, if you like biographies though, and I've got to think you do because you're maybe subscribed to this channel, you're at least watching it, maybe head over to CuriosityStream and check out bio-documentaries on Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, and so many more famous names. And you could also check out American Icons, a 9-part series that tells the story of Babe Ruth, Eleanor Roosevelt, Mark Twain, and more. Go to curiositystream.com for unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series. And right now, you guys can use the promo code GEOGRAPHICS to save 25% off the cost of an annual subscription, which comes out to $14.99. Not per month, per year, which is an incredible deal. So again, curiositystream.com/biographics, 25% off, making it just $14.99 for the whole year. And now back to today's video. From 1834, when Port Arthur's docks were built, right through till their closure in 1848, this one bay in Tasmania's southeast was the busiest shipyard on the entire island. Over their lifetime, the docks produced over 150 vessels, ranging from small light boats to 15 great ships that plied the waves across the world. In many ways, these docks were the fulfillment of Charles Booth's mission to improve the convicts while also working them. Those the colony's masters considered well-behaved could go there with no experience in shipbuilding and learn on the job, gaining a truly valuable skill. As such, many of those sent there were convicts on the younger side, including plenty of boys from the nearby juvenile colony, Point Puer. For a while, this industry was the jewel in Port Arthur's crown, a place famous down under for its engineering quality and the durability of its ships. Sadly, it was also the first major part of the colony to be phased out. Following a huge economic slump in the 1840s, people in the regular shipbuilding business began to question why they were being undercut by a bunch of bogans working for nearly free on a government site. They complained, people listened, and that was that. Yet even as Port Arthur lost its biggest industry, its convict population continued to grow like a waistline after a lifetime of Tim Tams, a trend that only increased with the arrival of Probation. Probation is the name we give to the second phase of convict transportation to Australia following the earlier assignment era. Basically, convicts prior to 1839 were assigned to either colonies or private settlers where they worked out their sentences. The trouble was, this meant convicts had wildly different experiences. Some might arrive to find a hard-ass cat o' nine tails wielding full metal jacket drill sergeant waiting for them, while others might get the Tasmanian equivalent of Mr. Rogers. Since everyone could agree that this was super unfair, Van Diemen's Land's new governor, Sir John Franklin, came up with a compromise. In 1837, he suggested that rather than assign convicts randomly, they should all be sent to stations on the basis of where their labor was needed most. Known as probation, this new system was sound in theory, but from the moment it was implicated in 1839, it ran headlong smack into problems, the biggest of which was New South Wales suddenly closing itself to new convict transports. That meant the bulk of Britain's deported criminals all being funneled to Van Diemen's Land, placing great strain on the system. During this era, it's estimated that 30% of all males on Tasmania at any time were convicts. In Port Arthur alone, the population ballooned from 1,100 at probation's introduction to 3,500 by 1844. And all those extra mouths to feed created a cascade of new problems. With the colony already struggling to become economically viable, it was decided the only way to cope with this influx was to boost on-site food production. That meant clearing new ground for agriculture, for crops. It also meant sinking insane human resources into building their own flour mill and granary. From 1842, one of the most common jobs a convict could land was helping build the gigantic water-powered mill that was supposed to transform the colony's fortunes. For 3 years, hundreds slaved away, making plans for a complex system of dams and aqueducts a reality. Yet it was all for nothing. It turned out that complex system could be better described as useless system. The whole time it was operational, the mill barely managed to rumble to life, much less make enough flour to feed thousands of convicts. So the colony cut its losses. Not long after the shipyard closed, the mill was decommissioned and refitted as the penitentiary. With it died any hope of making Port Arthur economically viable. But that doesn't mean they'd given up on the colony itself. Oh no. In fact, the penal complex was about to enter a whole new phase of psychological cruelty. I remember when we mentioned this video was taking place against a backdrop of evolving ideas on justice and punishment. Well, not long after the probation system was introduced, another such evolution took place, one which looked at the whippings and hard labor under men like Charles Booth and decided such practices were barbaric. Instead, a new theory was gaining traction, one which held that quiet contemplation worked better for criminals, allowing them space to look inside their souls and decide to change. If that doesn't sound too bad, though, consider yourself warned. At Port Arthur's separate prison, these ideas were taken to such an extreme that they crossed the line from punishment to psychological torture. Opening in 1848, the separate prison took its cue from Jeremy Bentham's idea of a panopticon, a prison in which inmates would always be visible to guards. The idea was that the threat of constant surveillance would make everyone behave, but just in case they didn't, the authorities added additional flourishes on top of Bentham's designs. The first was the concept of constant silence. From the moment a man arrived in separate prison, usually transferred in from another penal colony where he'd committed a crime, he was plunged into profound quietness. Talking, unless addressed by the guards, was absolutely forbidden, and prisoners wore hoods outside their cells to stop them from making eye contact with other inmates. Not that they spent much time outside. At separate prison, the daily routine involved 23 hours of isolation, where you were forbidden from making noise or doing anything but working menial tasks in complete silence. Outside, the corridors were padded, and the guards wore slippers, so any laugh or scream or sigh could immediately be heard and punished. Yet even during the 1 hour of freedom, things didn't improve. Prisoners exercised alone, they ate alone, and they attended chapel between screens so that they couldn't contact fellow inmates. And speaking of eating, those who broke the rules of this totalitarian silent retreat would be given only bread and water. Those who followed them would be given real food. Keep breaking the rules though, and things got considerably worse. This being a new, supposedly more humane style of incarceration, there were no beatings, there was no violence. Instead, rule breakers would be placed into next-level solitude, locked away in pitch-black cells where no sound or sight could disturb their contemplation for up to 30 days at a time. It was supposed to be a time to reflect. In reality, of course, it drove people mad. While no mental breakdowns were recorded in separate prisons' logs, there were reports of men hallucinating after being placed in solitary, while others seemed to have suffered lifelong psychological problems. Then there was the utterly dehumanizing aspect of it all, with prisoners forbidden from using their own names, allowed only to identify themselves by a number. Thankfully, new arrivals at Port Arthur typically only spent 4 months there before being sent out to work in the colony proper. Yet the mental strain of utter silence and no human contact still left traces on their souls. But even this panopticon was better than the colony's other infamous prison. Unlike separate prison, Point Puer was not designed to break people, but to improve them. Built on top of an outcrop of rock across the water from Point Arthur, it housed convict boys sent from Britain, children under 16, who'd been arrested for petty crime. Like the separate prison, the ideas behind it were enlightened. Boys would be kept there until they'd learned basic literacy and gained a skill, and then released at 16 to rejoin society. In practice, though, Point Puer was to juvenile detention what Rise of Skywalker was to Star Wars movies, an epoch-defining atrocity. The trouble was, boys couldn't leave the facility unless they'd learned literacy, but Point Puer didn't actually teach literacy as a skill. This meant some were effectively placed in indefinite detention, but even those who left didn't fare much better. Once Point Puer had succeeded in giving a boy a skill and checked he could read, he'd be taken to Hobart to start a new life. Again, great in principle, but only if those boys had somewhere to go. The majority of them knew no one in the town and didn't have a penny to their names, yet they were dumped there with no information and left to fend for themselves. Unsurprisingly, while some did well, particularly those who'd picked up shipbuilding skills, others spent the rest of their lives marred in poverty. Not that those lives were very long. Thanks to malnutrition at Point Puer, it's estimated 40% of the 3,000 boys who'd spent their formative years there died before the age of 40, on top of the 15% who died in the prison itself. As Chartist leader John Frost memorably said, "If I had 12 sons and it was left with me whether they should be transported or hanged, I should at once say to hang them soon rather than allow them to go to Point Puer." Thankfully, neither Point Puer nor Port Arthur Penal Colony itself were destined to be around for much longer. In 1844, convicts had been arriving regularly in Van Diemen's Land for exactly 4 decades. That's 40 years. To give some quick perspective on that, 40 years ago, Chernobyl was a state-of-the-art power plant. Blockbuster Video hadn't even opened yet, much less become obsolete, and randomly barking the phrases "Great Scott" or "It's your kids, Marty" wouldn't be considered pop culture references, but early signs that you were having a stroke. So for people living in Tasmania in 1844, convict transportation would have seemed like a fact of life, but that didn't mean they liked it. As that year dawned, it was on a new social movement springing up, one that demanded an end to transportation. With so many convicts on the islands in the Probation era, fears began to circulate that they were taking jobs from working-class locals. On top of that, resentment was starting to build about Britain treating the place like a giant dunny for dumping all their dregs in, especially since New South Wales had recently banned transportation. It was from these seeds that the Australian Anti-Transportation League grew, a vast movement centred on Van Diemen's Land dedicated to stopping the arrival of more convicts. They would have greater and faster success than anyone could have imagined. In 1851, Van Diemen's Land was granted its first elected legislative council. At the elections that year, those who opposed transportation won a thumping majority. At the same time, another evolution in convict policy had taken place in London, one focused on utilising the new series of prisons now being built across England. And so it was that in 1852, Britain and Van Diemen's Land came to a mutual agreement to end the transports. The last ship of convicts reached the island in 1853, while transportation of convicts to Western Australia would continue until 1868. In Tasmania, the practice was over. And that meant, in turn, the slow end of Port Arthur. As a place for repeat offenders from other penal colonies, the complex held out far longer than any other convict site. But as the 1850s progressed into the 1860s, soon even Port Arthur began to be abandoned. By the 1870s, the once overcrowded colony of 3,500 had been reduced to just 500 convicts, those too old, ill, or insane to be released into the wider community. As such, it basically spent its last years as a kind of surreal nursing home, doing its best to care for the few remaining residents until they passed on to the great penal colony in the sky. At last, in 1877, with only 160 or so residents left, Port Arthur closed down for good. Renamed Carnarvon, the site was auctioned off, its plots of land sold to create a regular community. A couple of decades later, wildfires tore through it, gutting the old separate prison and penitentiary. And so the story of Port Arthur ended, not in ice, but in fire and forgetfulness, as the world moved on. But as you already know, there would be an epilogue. As Australia became an independent state and something like a national consciousness began to awaken, people began to become more interested in local history. While it would take a long time for Australia's convict past to be officially acknowledged, regular blokes and Sheilas started visiting the sites of these old penal colonies. By 1927, Carnarvon was seeing so many visitors that it changed its name back to Port Arthur. Today, Port Arthur Historic Site is Tasmania's best-known attraction and one of the finest examples of Australia's colonial past, a collection of grand, haunted ruins spread over 40 hectares. In 2010, it was even inscribed on UNESCO's World Heritage List alongside 10 other Australian convict sites. A much-deserved nod to its importance in the nation's history. Of course, not everything in Port Arthur's post-convict history has been so rosy. In 1996, the historic area became the site of one of Australia's greatest tragedies when a gunman attacked people at the cafe, car park and toll booth, killing 35. But while it's important to remember such an awful event, this particular video is about the people who built Port Arthur, not those who tried to destroy it. And so rather than recount the events of that tragic day, we'll leave you with this final thought. In the years it was active, Port Arthur saw more cruelty and suffering than most places on Earth. From the genocide against Aboriginal peoples to the pain endured by the poor children of Point Puer. Yet it also saw something else, something far nobler. The beginning of an idea, of a common bonding that would soon help forge the sense of Australian nationhood. Its past may not have always been pretty, but the history of Port Arthur is important in uncountable ways. As such, it's fitting that it's now recognised as one of Tasmania's greatest historic sites.